Hello everyone, welcome to your lecture on the brain, primarily the structures and the functions. Please understand that this is content that we will not be covering as in-depth in class, but it is incredibly important that you learn all of the structures and their associated functions. This will set up the basis for pretty much everything that we talk about further in this class. We're going to begin with the regions of the brain. We're going to talk about three major regions of the brain. What you may find is that in other courses, the brain will be divvied up into different regions. Some courses will talk about a mammalian brain versus a reptilian brain. If you hear those terms, essentially what they're talking about is newer or higher order formed areas of the brain that are going to be utilized by humans or apes, while the reptilian brain, those are going to be structures that are going to be universal to most animals. For this course, however, we're going to separate the brain into three sections, and it's going to be the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. Now, the brain stem as a structure is going to be something that is going to include both hindbrain and midbrain functions. So the brain stem itself is not going to be a separate section. It is not synonymous with hindbrain. Please make sure that you understand that. So when we talk about these things, hindbrain, basic survival. This is often what people refer to when they're talking about the reptilian brain. The midbrain, this is going to be towards more of the interior or the center of the brain. It's going to help with simple movement, sensory information. Think of it as almost like a massive distribution center. And the forebrain. This is what we're going to usually refer to when we're talking about the mammalian brain. And that's going to have your limbic system, which is going to have your kind of emotional regulation, memories, some of your higher order kind of behaviors. And then it's also going to have the four lobes or the four cortexes of the brain. When we start talking through these, the hindbrain is going to have three structures that you need to memorize. The midbrain, you will have a single structure that you need to memorize. And the forebrain, honestly, it's like 11 or 12 different structures that you need to memorize. I will do my best to give you some hints on how to remember them, but truly this will require that you go back and study. Flashcards could be your best friend right here. We're going to start with the hindbrain. When looking at the hindbrain, the three major structures that you need to know are the cerebellum, the medulla, and the pons. The cerebellum is going to look like almost a separate structure from the brain. It's sometimes referred to as the little brain. As we learn more about the brain, we're finding more and more about this structure having much more importance than just basic life support. The medulla and the pons, these two structures are going to be located on the brain stem. With both of these structures, please remember that the brain stem itself is going to continue into the middle of the brain. So they are hindbrain structures, while later we'll talk about a structure called the reticular formation that runs through the brainstem and terminates at the midbrain. So brainstem is going to be different than hindbrain. Hindbrain is the most basic. We see these structures in pretty much all animals. So the first one we talk about is the medulla. And for medulla, I always try to remember medulla with something that sounds similar, and so medulla medieval. And if you want to think about the best way to kill someone in medieval times, you would have just chopped their head off. Now, the reason that I use this as my memory or my mnemonic for the medulla is because it's this structure at the very, very base of your brainstem where essentially the spinal column attaches to the brainstem. This structure itself, this bundle of neurons, helps with blood circulation, breathing, maintaining muscle tone. The fact that you were probably either sitting upright or maybe even just kind of propping your head up on your hand and laying in bed, any of those things require muscle tone. We often have to maintain muscle tone without ever thinking about it. It's the only way that we stay upright. It's going to help us with things that are going to be reflex based, like sneezing and coughing. Now, we don't really think about that, but anytime a foreign particle gets into your airway, the best way for us to deal with that is to sneeze or to cough. And then also salivating. Very first step to eating food is salivating. We do this at an unconscious level. So this structure in the brain functions as a basic life support. Even a very tiny hemorrhage to the area of that is being supplied blood to this area of the brain, if that were to rupture, that would be instantaneous death. So This very specific area of the hindbrain supports our breathing, our blood circulation, our muscle tone, things that we don't think about, but things that we absolutely rely upon to be alive. We're going to move from the medulla up to the pons. When we're talking about the pons is going to be a structure that's involved in sleep and arousal. This structure is part of the hindbrain, and it is located on the brainstem. The very important purpose of the pons is that during your sleep stage, when you go into a dream, when we go into what's called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, this stage is where you have your very vivid dreams, whether they're in color or sound, there's visuals, there's motion, there's emotion, all of those things are present. Something must prevent your body from actively acting out what's going on. So your body is paralyzed during this state. The pons is the structure in the brain that essentially blocks any motor messages coming from the motor cortex of your frontal lobe from making it to your body. In a sense, you are paralyzed. The other thing is that the pons helps with arousal. And when we talk about arousal in psychology, we're talking about alertness, awakefulness, being present in the moment. And so this will also help you reverse that and feel more awake. There will be another structure that acts more like an on-off switch to our alertness, and we'll talk about that. That's going to be the single structure that you need to know from the midbrain. So for the pons, know that it helps with sleep and arousal during your REM state. This is what blocks any motor messages, and that it also attaches the cerebellum to the brainstem. It's a bundle of fibers that kind of wraps around and anchors it. The cerebellum, I mentioned briefly before, is often known as the little brain. Now, this little brain used to be thought of as just kind of a subset of the brain, that it wasn't really important. And the more we learn about the brain, the more we learn that the cerebellum is incredibly important and is taking on a lot of higher order functions than what we thought before. So the cerebellum is going to look like a separate structure that is just at the base of the brain. Now, it is not technically part of the brain stem itself, but it connects to the brain stem. If you play an instrument and you can coordinate your hands to play the instrument really well, that's your cerebellum at work. If you can walk heel to toe and alternate feet left, right, that ability to coordinate, that smooth coordination, that's coming from your cerebellum. If you can write smoothly with a pen or a pencil and you can grip it in your fingertips as opposed to kind of wrapping your entire hand around it, that's your cerebellum. So all of these really what we call fine coordinated muscular movements that we use continuously, that's coming from your cerebellum. The cerebellum also is going to help you with your balance or your sense of equilibrium. So finding your horizon, making sure that you're not, dizzy or imbalanced. And then the last thing that we really get from the cerebellum that's really important for us is this idea of procedural memories. Procedural memories are going to be the how to do memories. So you may have remembered from one of your readings that after you have repeated a neural pattern over and over and over again, eventually you don't process it in the same area of the brain. It goes to a different area of the brain just to kind of be stored. And that's what happens with motor memory. When we talk about muscle memory or motor memory or these things, the first couple times you do anything physical, you concentrate very, very deeply on it. But after repetition, it becomes almost second nature. That's a procedural memory. They're stored in the cerebellum. So commands for muscle movement come from the motor cortex, which is going to be in the frontal lobe of your brain. However, what allows it to be integrated and not jerky and very smooth comes from the cerebellum. When we talk about organizing sensory information that guides movement, we're talking about our sense of balance, or what we'll later call our kinesthetic sense. The fact that you know where your feet are without ever having to look at them, that comes from a really cool relay system between tendons and nerve cells. Your brain sends out a message to your foot saying, where are you in space? It sends a message back, the cerebellum processes it, and you go, oh, I know where my foot is. Really, the only thing that disrupts that is if you have a body part that falls asleep. You restrict the blood flow to it. That also cuts off the firing from the neurons. And so you later get that pins and needles feeling. It's when all of that firing goes back to the brain and the brain's processing these messages that were absent. When we're talking about that, that might be the only time that you have a hard time locating a limb or a body part in space. But if you've ever watched an acrobat or a gymnast or a figure skater, They have this amazing ability to know where their limbs are in space, and most athletes do too. That's coming from the cerebellum. The reason I have the idea of a DUI test up here, the reason that the two most kind of basic but also required DUI tests that are given by the state of Virginia, one is called the walk and turn. You walk out 10 steps, you turn around, you walk back. And then the other is called the one-legged stand. These are mandatory by the state, and it's because your cerebellum is the first structure of the brain really impacted by alcohol. And so when that structure is depressed, you start to lose your balance. And then I did talk to you guys about procedural memories. These are your how to do memories, not the stories of yourself or what happened yesterday, but literally the physical memories that you have. Here's a diagram of those three structures. In the pink, you're seeing the pons. Sleep, arousal, shuts off motor messages to the lower parts of the body. The medulla, right at the base of the skull. So again, medulla, medieval death, you put a knife or a sword through that and the person's dead. Well, let's just say you damage the medulla, you're going to be dead. And the cerebellum, that's your sense of balance, procedural memories, coordinated muscle movements. One student once told me that they remembered the word PONS by turning it into an acronym, and it was perfect one night's sleep. I had another student tell me that he would never want to fall asleep in a pond. So that was their way of trying to remember PONS. Cerebellum, I'm sure there's probably some mnemonic device in there. However, I really just go through, and we'll talk about it so much, I memorized the major kind of contributing factors of the cerebellum. Now we're on to the midbrain. For the midbrain, there is a single structure that you need to know. Before we get to it, please understand that this is a region. It's an area. So there's more than just one structure there, but it's an area that's located between the spinal cord and the hindbrain and the forebrain. So again, literally middle of the brain. It is the area with the highest dopamine production. So this area of the brain we think is where many of our neurotransmitters are going to be produced, and then they travel outward to other areas of the brain. It helps with coordinated movements and sensory information. And the great thing about this, you need to know one structure that is going to run through the midbrain, and that's called your reticular formation. Now, before I told you that the pons deals with sleep and arousal, the reticular formation also deals with sleep and arousal. Now, just because they are very similar in how we describe what they do, you will never see these two together in a possible answer set. But the reticular formation has more of an on-off switch type responsibility for your body. And what I mean is when you go to sleep, what can possibly turn you off, like literally put you out, is your reticular formation. Some of you guys may have experienced micro sleeps where you close your eyes and you're out for like 10 or 20 seconds and then you kind of like pop back up and you're like, whoa, was I asleep? You probably were. That was probably your reticular formation putting you to sleep. That can be incredibly dangerous. It's a huge indicator of massive sleep deprivation, especially while driving. We have had some of the most horrific car accidents and, death-related crashes because of people driving drowsy. When we look at this, this is going to put you to sleep, and then it will also simultaneously help wake you back up. This will also react to fight or flight signals. But primarily for this one, you want to know that while it can help you cause general alarm in your body, that kind of sense of, impending doom, get ready for a fight or flight situation, it's really important in helping you fall asleep and stay asleep. If there were damage to this structure of the brain, it could cause you to lapse into a coma. The reticular formation is a bundle of nerve fibers that runs through the brainstem and terminates in the middle of the brain. So what you're looking at here is the brown structures to the interior. That's your reticular formation. The part that's at the very top, that's a thalamus. That's actually a forebrain structure. The part that's dead in the center, well, that part that wraps around, not the kind of weird striated part, that's your pons. Just below it is the medulla, and then off to the far right hand, that is going to be your cerebellum. So it literally runs through the center of your brainstem. We're now going into the forebrain. So just to review really quickly, we had talked about the hindbrain, which you had three structures, the midbrain, which had a single structure, and the forebrain is going to have several. The forebrain, the first structure we'll talk about is the thalamus. Now, if you look at the picture that you have presented here to the right, the thalamus is the red structure, and you have a left thalamus and a right thalamus. As you probably have gotten from readings and what we'll talk about in class, there's a structure that connects the two hemispheres of the brain, the left and the right, called the corpus callosum. All information travels between these two hemispheres through this bridge of neural fibers. Your thalamus is going to have a left side and a right side. Your hippocampus is going to have a left side and a right side. Your hypothalamus will have a left side and a right side. All of the cortex of the brain will have a left side and a right side. What happens on the left side is going to control what happens on the right side of your body, and what happens in the right side of your brain is going to control what's going on the left side of your body. So for your thalamus, it receives sensory information. It receives every sensory kind of signal except for your sense of smell. That means your vision from your left eye is processed in your right thalamus. The auditory sounds that come in from your left ear are processed in your right thalamus. The sensory stimulation that you get that comes in through your body on the left side gets processed through the right thalamus. Now, that doesn't mean the thalamus detects or gives you the interpretation of these sensations. What the thalamus essentially does is it recognizes the sensory signal and then sends it to the correct part of the brain. When we talk about people who are going to have synesthesia, what they think is that it's this structure of the brain that doesn't send the messages to the right direction or to the right part of the cortex. So you have somebody who will associate a color with a certain smell or a number with a certain taste, and it's because visual signals go to different parts of the brain other than just the visual cortex. So we'll talk a little bit more about synesthesia. If you're really interested in it, there's a reading in the supplementary reading folder if you want to look it up. But this entire structure's purpose is that right now you're getting both visual and auditory information simultaneously. That information has to go to the right part or the right cortex of the brain. This structure will sort out the electrical signal that is visual and send it to the occipital lobe. It'll sort through the electrical signal that happens to be auditory and send it to the temporal lobe. It routes everything to the right area for your senses. So sometimes I remember thalamus and I just say, I'll kind of in my head go, thalamus is like tell my. So tell my senses. And so I just take the T, the M, and the S, tell my senses, thalamus. Now we're going to talk about the limbic system. The limbic system is going to be made up predominantly of three major structures that you need to know about, and it's known as the pleasure center of the brain. This is going to be the area that is going to exist just above the thalamus and below the cerebral cortex. Usually we're talking about above the brainstem, below the cortex. But when we're looking at this, everything that you do that gives you kind of feedback on pleasure or things that are kind of necessary for your existence seem to happen here outside of, the breathing circulation that happens in the lower structures. So with the limbic system, loosely connected network of structures located roughly along the border between the cortex and then the deeper subcortical areas, it is in the kind of interior center of the brain. Again, all of these structures, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, there's a left and a right. You have two. So your hypothalamus is going to be right next to your thalamus. In fact, it's just slightly under it. And this is going to help regulate things like your eating behavior. It is going to be part of a biofeedback loop that tells you when you're hungry and when you're not hungry. So later when we talk about hunger, you're going to find out that there are people who have had their stomachs surgically removed, but you still feel hunger. So it can't just be the stomach that causes it. It's actually the brain. It's where cravings exist. It'll help us with sleep. So sleep and arousal pop up here, but this is really secondary. Really go with reticular formation and the pons for sleep and arousal. This is the structure in the brain that regulates sexual activity, sexual desire, and we are talking about sexual in the actual sexual sense. It also has some play in things like emotion and aggression. It helps with temperature regulation. So if you run hot or cold, not running a temperature, but literally your just general base body temperature, it's coming from this structure. And it also helps regulate thirst. So thirst, hunger, sex, and body temperature are all regulated by this structure. Amygdala. With amygdala, I always put anger, aggression, autonomic nervous system. This is your emotional center of the brain. literally all emotions, but usually we're talking more of the fight or flight type emotions. So your amygdala has the greatest activity in fight or flight situations. Males have larger amygdalas. They have a larger emotional center to the brain. When we say emotional, usually we're talking weepy and sad in kind of the social context. When we're talking emotional as far as the amygdala and what men are more reactive to, it's fight or flight. So it's more likely that a guy is going to show aggression or anger as a fallback response to really any situation than other emotions, just on a biological sense. That doesn't mean that they don't have a spectrum of emotions, that they can't feel happiness or joy, sadness, or contentment, but they have very easy access to fight or flight. The last structure is the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is going to be your memory processing, and it actually kind of activates very similar to the thalamus. The hippocampus takes what we have as far as repeated neural firing, and it knows how to elicit those neural kind of circuits. So your memories aren't just going to be a single nerve cell activating or the storage system in your head. It literally is information that's coming from your visual center, from your auditory center, from your emotional center, all of these from your frontal lobe and your logic center. All of these areas combine together and they build memory. The hippocampus knows how to excite the right neural pathways. So much like the thalamus distributes things to the correct cortex, the hippocampus basically breaks down memories and distributes them to the right cortex. And then when you try to elicit a memory, it pulls at all of those kind of appropriate neural threads and puts together a single memory. The cool thing about this is that you can't remember two things simultaneously. And I know that seems almost kind of like a stupid comment, but you can't, because the hippocampus can only spark one memory at a time. So you might be able to flip-flop, but you can't really just pull one at a time. Now we're talking about the cerebral cortex, and this is what we call the new brain. This is going to be that mushy gushy, I don't know, goopy part of the exterior that looks like a wrinkled walnut. It's going to be responsible for all of our conscious thought. In the Brain 101 reading, you got the idea that the cerebrum, that very thin neural layer, is about the size of a pillowcase. If you were to flatten it out, here we're calling it a pizza. So it's going to be about 80% of the brain's overall weight. All of those little kind of wrinkles and grooves allow for more volume or surface area, which we need for the cerebrum. 75% of all of the neural connections lie within the cerebral cortex. Again, that lovely little thin cerebral layer. You have a left and a right hemisphere, and those two things are connected by the corpus callosum, by this bundle of nerves that keep left side and right side interconnected. Here you have all of the structures predominantly kind of listed. There's a few that are missing, but not many. You get a really good view of where the reticular formation lies in the brainstem, but still considered a midbrain structure. You have the medulla. We're missing the pons, but you can go back and look at that one. Pons still does sleep and arousal. One of the interesting things that you will see here is you see the location of the hippocampus as it kind of wraps around the thalamus and the hypothalamus, but at the end of the hippocampus you have your amygdala. Those two structures are very close in location and they play off of each other very well. Strong emotions make very easy memories, and they're very linked to each other. So you have a good view of your hypothalamus, your hippocampus, and your amygdala that make up your limbic system. The thalamus is not part of the limbic system. It is part of the forebrain, but not the limbic system. Now we get to talk about the four lobes of the brain. We're going to talk about the parietal, the occipital, the temporal, and last we're going to talk about the frontal lobe. All of the lobes, with the exception of the occipital lobe, have usually one or two other parts to them that you need to know. So for the parietal lobe, this has a couple of really cool things. First, the parietal lobe has an area called the somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex receives signals from the thalamus and understands the sensation of touch. We'll talk about in class the fact that areas of your body that are more sensitive to touch, like your fingertips or your face, take up a much greater amount of space on that cortex. The somatosensory cortex is at the very front of the parietal lobe. Next to this responsibility of touch, and actually just as important, it helps us understand our body's positioning in space. So I will talk about this idea. If you were running and you were playing tag, and let's say it was outside and there were a lot of trees, and you're trying to avoid somebody, and you're thinking, can I get my body to fit between those two really close trees? If you can visualize your body and you can pretty much guess that your body can fit through that space, it's because you're using your parietal lobe. It's called a 3D mental rotation. It's your body positioning. You don't look at your arms and your legs when you're playing sports to make sure they're in the right position. Your parietal lobe sets it up properly. It gives you kind of a body map. You don't think about what you're doing with your feet and your hands when you're driving. You trust your body map to be in the right position. Other parts of this 3D mental rotation is also very evident in video game playing, puzzles, moving furniture. I know that sounds weird, but if you've ever picked up a piece of furniture and you're like, can I get that through the doorway? And you look at it and then you look at the doorway and you're like, yeah, this is how I'd have to change the orientation of the piece of furniture to get it through. That's 3D rotation. An even more practical one is when you look at parallel parking. Will your car fit in that space? You have kind of a visual idea of how big your car is. You have a visual idea of how big the space is. And if you can, in your mind's eye, get that car to turn in and then pull in straight, you have figured out 3D mental rotation. Now, again, this is one of those things from an evolutionary point. Men have larger parietal lobes. I told you guys before in class I had a hard time remembering this person's name, but when we talk about the left parietal lobe, you have a lot of mathematical ability, abstract concepts, metaphors. That's where those things are generated, is in the parietal lobe. And so Einstein had a huge left parietal lobe. Right parietal lobe, mental model of the spatial layout of your world, all of this. Males would have had a greater right parietal lobe 13,000 years ago, because it would have been important for them to be able to travel miles away while tracking a herd and be able to find their way back home. It would have been important for them to travel miles away and track a herd and be able to throw an object through space and hit their target so their families wouldn't starve. So this structure just is a little more developed in men. That doesn't mean that this is something women can't do. In fact, you can help build kind of the landscape of your brain by engaging in activities that are a little bit harder for you. Parallel park when you have to. Play video games and kind of work on 3D mental rotation. There's different ways for you to do, put together puzzles. All of that helps with this ability. So it's not that women don't have it. It's just that for a biological reason, it seems to come with greater ease to men. The easiest of the lobes to memorize is going to be the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is your primary visual cortex, and it's going to be located at the very back of your head. So if you were to take your hand and place it like at the base of your skull, that's your occipital lobe. If you were to go one hand higher up, you would be at your parietal lobe. So if you were to rest your hands on top of each other at the back of your head, the lower hand would be occipital, the higher hand would be your parietal lobe. So the occipital lobe, or optics, are going to be located in the back of your head, and it's going to be your visual processing center. Fairly easy. One of the things that for students who like to watch boxing or MMA, if you've ever heard that they're not allowed to strike to the back of the head, there's a reason for that. You can't fight someone who can't see, and a punch to the back of the head could knock out someone's vision. A good solid hit to the back of the head could cause someone to see stars. The temporal lobe. Hear the word tempo in that. So think tempo, music. This is going to be your primary auditory cortex. This is where most of your, this is where your hearing is processed, not most of, this is where your hearing is processed. You're also going to process your sense of smell, and this is going to have what we call your vestibular sense, your sense of where your horizon is. So if you've ever been on a boat and got seasick because you felt everything was wonky, it was messing with your vestibular sense, your sense of balance. It was probably also messing with some of your inner ear. Now, your temporal lobe also has a specific area that helps with speech processing. This area only exists on the left hemisphere of the brain, and it's called Wernicke's area. So another German, the W sounds like a V. Wernicke's area is what allows you to understand the words that literally are coming out of my mouth. This is one of the few areas of the brain that is declared as unique to humans alone. It is on the left hemisphere of the brain in the temporal. So your temporal lobe helps you with hearing, and hearing helps you with understanding. So it's very appropriately placed. If you have someone who is going to have a surgery like a hemispherectomy and the left hemisphere of their brain is removed, brain's plasticity will actually allow this area to reappear on the right cortex. But with normal development, with no other kind of surgical interruptions, your Wernicke's area, left hemisphere, temporal lobe, helps with language comprehension. We're at the end for this, and we're talking about the frontal lobe. Your frontal lobe is literally in the front of your head. Your temporal lobe is the thing that lets you hear tempo right by your ears. So your frontal lobe. When we're talking about this, this is the part that helps you with planning, decision making. We call it the executive center. Now, you guys have an area called the prefrontal cortex that is not yet fully developed. All the bulk is there, but the connections aren't all made. Eventually, all the connections will be made by about the age of 25 or so, with all final refinements happening maybe into your early 30s. Your frontal lobe helps you plan. It helps mitigate your limbic system and other parts of your brain that are very, very fully developed. Now, this helps us with planning, but there's two other very specific areas in the brain that you need to know. One is going to be Broca's area. Broca's area allows for muscle movement for speech. The other part, and you'll see this again in lecture and class, is your motor cortex. Now, the parietal lobe had the sensory cortex at the very front. The frontal lobe has the motion or motor cortex at its very back. So sense of touch and motion are butted up against each other with motion in the frontal lobe. This has the same graphing areas of your body like your fingers that have a lot of different ways to kind of move and articulate and I'm sorry, not articulate, gesticulate. They have greater space on that structure in the brain. Things like your knee that just go forward and backwards, not so much space. And we'll look at a homunculus that will show you how those two things lay out. So your frontal lobe, executive decision making. It's judgment. It's your motor cortex. It is your ability to move your mouth for speech. And then there's these really cool things called mirror neurons. And the mirror neurons in your frontal lobe allow you to see somebody cry and then allow your brain to take on that activity as if you are physically crying, and then you become empathetic. You feel for them. The cool thing with athletes, it lets you watch someone hit a ball, and just by watching them, you become better at hitting a ball. You see somebody, shoot a basket, and all of a sudden your form becomes better. For musicians, the same thing. Watch an expert guitar player, and just by watching it, your brain starts to modify and refine some of those abilities. Now, you don't get perfect just by doing it and not performing the action, but if you're performing the action, you might actually get better by watching. So it helps us with new motor skills, and it helps us with empathy. And some deficits in this may be seen in people with autistic disorders where they can't literally feel what other people feel or kind of conceptualize it. It might be a deficit in mirror neurons. This also is an area where we talk about things like association areas. The frontal lobe makes a lot of association areas to the other cortex of the brains. These associations kind of make a holistic conscious experience, but we'll talk about that in class as well. So hopefully this one works out and you guys got to the end of it. This is everything that you need to know for structure and function of the brain, with a couple of things being pieced in class lecture.